The screen door slammed shut with a violence that made Sarah's coffee cup rattle against the kitchen counter. And when she turned, her son stood there trembling like a leaf caught in October wind. His face had drained of all color, leaving behind a pallor she'd only seen once before, the night his father died, and his small hands clutched at his chest as though trying to hold his heart inside. "Mom," he whispered, and the word came out broken, fractured into syllables that didn't quite fit together anymore. She dropped everything and rushed to him, her maternal instinct screaming that something terrible had crossed the threshold with him, something that clung to his skin like invisible frost. Thomas was only 9 years old, but in that moment he looked ancient, as if he'd witnessed something that aged him decades in mere minutes. His eyes, usually bright with the mischief of childhood, now held a darkness that didn't belong to a boy who still slept with a nightlight shaped like a rocket ship. "The lady," he managed to say, his voice barely above a breath. "The lady in the mirror talked to me." Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins because she knew exactly which house he meant. The Victorian wreck next door that had stood empty for 7 years. Its windows like dead eyes watching their neighborhood decay. She'd told him 1,000 times never to go near that place, never to even look at it too long. But curiosity was a cruel master to children. The Mercer house had a reputation that predated even Sarah's arrival on Willowbrook Lane 15 years ago. Whispered about in hushed tones at neighborhood barbecues and PTA meetings. Old Mrs. Henderson claimed she'd seen lights flickering in the upper windows on moonless nights, while Mr. Kowalski swore he'd heard a woman's laughter echoing from inside when he passed by at dawn. But those were just stories, weren't they? The kind of suburban legends that grew like weeds in quiet towns where nothing ever happened, where people needed something to break the monotony of their carefully manicured lives. Yet as Sarah looked at her son's face, at the genuine terror etched into every feature, she realized that some legends grew from seeds of truth. She knelt before Thomas, her hands finding his shoulders, feeling how he shook beneath her touch like a bird with a broken wing. "What did she say to you, baby?" The question felt dangerous leaving her lips, as if speaking it aloud gave power to whatever had happened in that abandoned house. Thomas's eyes filled with tears that refused to fall, suspended there like tiny crystals of pure fear. "She said she's been waiting," he whispered, and then his voice cracked completely. "She said she knew you'd send someone eventually." The words made no sense, yet they struck Sarah with the force of recognition, as if some deep part of her had always known this day would come. Outside, the October sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, and the Mercer house stood silent next door. Its peeling paint and sagging porch seemed to mock the neat lawns and cheerful facades of the surrounding homes, a wound in the fabric of suburban normalcy. Sarah pulled Thomas close, feeling his heart hammering against her chest, like something trying to escape, and over his shoulder, she could see it, just barely, a flicker of movement in one of the upstairs windows. It might have been a trick of the fading light, a reflection of clouds passing overhead, but Sarah knew better. Something in that house was awake now, and whatever had been sleeping for 7 years had finally opened its eyes. Sleep refused to come that night, and Sarah found herself standing at her bedroom window at 3 a.m, staring at the dark silhouette of the Mercer house against the starless sky. Thomas had finally drifted off around midnight, after she'd given him some chamomile tea, and sat with him until his breathing evened out. But his sleep was restless, punctuated by whimpers that made her heart break. She'd called the police earlier, her voice shaking as she explained that her son had been in the abandoned property, but Deputy Morrison had been dismissive, suggesting Thomas had an overactive imagination and she should just keep him away from the house. But it wasn't that simple, was it? Because Sarah recognized the description Thomas had given her of the woman in the mirror, though she'd never told her son about the photograph she'd found in the attic when they first moved in. The photograph was still there, hidden in a shoebox beneath old Christmas decorations and her ex-husband's forgotten belongings. and Sarah hadn't looked at it in years, but she remembered it perfectly. A sepia-toned portrait of a young woman with dark hair swept up in an elaborate Gibson girl style, her eyes seeming to follow the viewer with an intensity that felt almost alive. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Eleanor Mercer, 1912. The coincidence was too precise, too deliberate, and Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the windowsill, her knuckles white in the darkness. What had Thomas stumbled into? And more importantly, why did this Eleanor woman claim she'd been waiting, that she knew Sarah would send someone? Morning came with a gray heaviness that matched Sarah's exhaustion, and she made Thomas breakfast while he sat at the kitchen table in silence, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate without eating. He looked so small in his pajamas with dinosaurs on them, so vulnerable, and guilt gnawed at her insides like a living thing. "I'm not going to school today," he said quietly, and it wasn't a request, but a statement of fact. Sarah nodded, too tired to argue, too frightened to let him out of her sight. She called in sick to her job at the insurance office, ignoring her supervisor's irritated sigh. Because what did quarterly reports matter when your child had encountered something that had stolen the light from his eyes? By noon, Sarah had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She was going to the Mercer house herself. She couldn't leave Thomas alone, so she called her sister Rachel, who lived 40 minutes away and had always been the practical one, the one who believed in logical explanations and dismissed anything that smelled of superstition. Rachel arrived within the hour, her skepticism evident in the way she raised her eyebrow when Sarah explained the situation. But she agreed to stay with Thomas anyway. "You're going to see it's just an empty house," Rachel said firmly, as if saying it with enough conviction could make it true. Sarah wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to the rational world where mirrors were just glass and abandoned houses were just wood and nails. But Thomas's face haunted her, and she knew she'd find no peace until she understood what had happened. The afternoon sun was weak and watery as Sarah stood on the cracked sidewalk in front of the Mercer house, its Victorian architecture looming above her like a monument to decay. The front gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the garden had long ago surrendered to weeds and wild growth that seemed to reach toward her with grasping fingers. A faded "for sale" sign tilted at an angle near the mailbox, the realtor's phone number barely visible beneath years of weather damage. Sarah's phone felt heavy in her pocket. She'd programmed 911 into speed dial before leaving, a small comfort that felt utterly inadequate. Taking a deep breath that tasted of autumn rot and old wood, she pushed open the gate, and the screech of metal on metal announced her arrival like a warning bell that echoed far too long in the still afternoon air. The porch steps groaned beneath Sarah's weight, each board protesting her intrusion with sounds that seemed almost alive, almost resentful of her presence. The front door stood slightly ajar, which struck her as wrong immediately. She'd lived next to this house for 15 years and had never seen that door anything but firmly closed, sealed against the world like a coffin lid. Had Thomas opened it? Or had it been waiting open, an invitation extended from something inside that knew she would come? Her hand trembled as she pushed it wider, and the hinges screamed in a way that made her teeth ache. The sound of rust and time and something else she couldn't name. The interior exhaled stale air that tasted of dust and mildew, and underneath it all, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a funeral home. The foyer opened before her like a throat, all dark wood and shadows that seemed too thick for an autumn afternoon, and a grand staircase curved upward into deeper darkness on her left. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, revealing water stains that looked disturbingly like reaching hands or screaming faces, depending on how the light hit them. Sarah's footsteps echoed on hardwood floors, covered in a carpet of dust so thick it recorded her passage like footprints in snow, and she noticed with growing unease that there were other tracks here. Small ones, child-sized ones, leading deeper into the house. Thomas had gone further than she'd imagined, and the fear that clutched her heart squeezed tighter with each step she took following his trail. Her grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its hands frozen at 3:47, and Sarah wondered if that was AM or PM, and more disturbingly, from which day or year or decade. She called out, "Hello?" and immediately regretted it, because her voice sounded small and foolish in this space. And worse, it felt like an invitation, like she was announcing herself to whatever waited in the upper floors. The dust tracks led to a room off the main hallway, and through the half-open door, Sarah could see what had once been a parlor, furniture still arranged as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any second. A tea service sat on a side table, cups positioned around a teapot as though expecting guests, and when Sarah entered the room, she could swear she smelled fresh tea brewing, impossible as that was. A portrait hung above the fireplace, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat because she recognized the woman immediately. The same face from the photograph in her attic, the same Eleanor Mercer. But here the painting was larger, more detailed, and those eyes seemed to track her movement across the room. "You came." The voice was soft, feminine, and came from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around Sarah like silk scarves that were simultaneously comforting and suffocating. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering so hard she felt it might crack her ribs. But the room remained empty except for the dust motes, dancing in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to inject authority into her voice and failing completely. A laugh answered her, melodious and cold as winter rain. And then she saw it, in the mirror above the mantel, right below Eleanor's portrait. A reflection that wasn't her own. A woman in an Edwardian dress stood where Sarah's reflection should be. Her dark hair piled high, her lips curved in a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Sarah stumbled backward, her rational mind screaming that this couldn't be happening, that mirrors don't work this way, that the laws of physics and reality were absolute and unchanging. But the woman in the mirror remained, solid and present and terribly, impossibly real. "Don't be afraid," Eleanor said, though her smile suggested she knew fear was the only appropriate response. "I've been waiting such a long time for you, Sarah Mitchell, ever since you moved into my sister's house." The words made no sense. Sarah had bought her house from a couple named the Hendersons. There had been no mention of any connection to the Mercer family. Yet Eleanor continued, her reflection moving independently in the mirror, stepping closer to the glass, as if it were a window rather than a reflective surface. "Your house and mine share more than a property line, you see. They share a foundation, a history, and a debt that's been waiting to be paid for over a century." Sarah's legs threatened to give out beneath her, and she gripped the back of a dusty armchair to steady herself, its upholstery crumbling beneath her fingers like dried flowers. "What debt?" The question emerged as barely a whisper, but Eleanor heard it clearly, her smile widening in the mirror until it seemed to split her face in ways that faces shouldn't split. "The debt of blood and silence," she replied, and her image in the mirror began to move, pacing back and forth within the confines of the reflective frame like a caged animal that had learned patience through long centuries of waiting. "In 1912, my sister Catherine murdered me in the room directly above this one, pushed me down these very stairs you climbed to get here, and in my dying breath, I cursed her and all who would live in the house she stole from me." The casual way Eleanor spoke of her own murder sent ice crawling down Sarah's spine, and she understood with sudden terrible clarity that she'd been living in a dead woman's curse for 15 years. "But I never knew," Sarah protested, her voice rising with desperation. "I bought that house in good faith. I didn't know anything about you or your sister or what happened here." Eleanor's laugh echoed through the parlor again, and this time it held a note of genuine amusement, though cruel and sharp as broken glass. Ignorance has never been an adequate defense against fate, Dear Sarah, Catherine changed her name, married, had children. Children who had children who had children. And eventually one of her descendants sold the house to the Hendersons, who sold it to you. But the curse doesn't care about the passage of time or the innocence of those caught in its web. In the mirror, Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the glass from her side, and Sarah watched in horror as the surface rippled like water, the boundary between their worlds growing thin and permeable. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Eleanor's reflection paused its pacing, turning to face Sarah directly, and in her eyes was something that transcended mere malice. It was the accumulated rage and grief of 113 years, compressed and distilled into a force that could bend reality itself. "I want what was stolen from me. My life, my future, my voice. For more than a century, I've been trapped in mirrors and glass and reflective surfaces, able to watch the world but never touch it, never breathe it, never live it. But children are different. Children are pure and malleable, their spirits not yet hardened into the cynical shells adults wear. Your son heard me because children always do, and through him, I can finally cross back." The implication crashed over Sarah like a physical wave, and she understood now why Eleanor had spoken to Thomas, why she'd been waiting for Sarah to send someone. No. The word came out with more force than Sarah knew she possessed, and she straightened her spine, letting go of the armchair and standing as tall as she could manage, despite the terror making her whole body shake. "You can't have my son. I don't care what happened to you. I don't care about your curse or your revenge. You will not touch Thomas." Eleanor's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been respect or might have been irritation. It was impossible to tell. Bold words from a woman standing in my house, bound by my curse, living in the stolen home of my murderer's bloodline. "You think you have any power here, Sarah Mitchell? You think your love for your child is stronger than 113 years of rage?" But even as Eleanor spoke, her image in the mirror seemed to flicker slightly, as if Sarah's defiance had created some small crack in her absolute confidence. Sarah's mind raced through everything Thomas had told her, every detail of his encounter, and one thing stood out. Eleanor had said she knew Sarah would send someone, implying she'd been watching, waiting, planning. "You've been in my mirrors," Sarah realized aloud, the horror of it washing over her like toxic rain. "All these years, you've been watching us from every reflective surface in my house, waiting for the right moment." Eleanor inclined her head in acknowledgement, pleased that Sarah was finally understanding the scope of what she faced. Every bathroom mirror, every window at night, every polished surface. I've been there, learning you, studying you, waiting for the moment when you'd be vulnerable enough, when your son would be curious enough. And yesterday, when Thomas pressed his face against the window of this house, looking in with those innocent eyes, I knew my wait was finally over. The grandfather clock in the corner suddenly chimed despite its frozen hands. 3 deep gongs that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, and Sarah realized with dawning dread that time in this house followed different rules. "There has to be another way," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, despite the fear still coursing through her veins like poison. "If you want justice for what your sister did, if you want to cross back into the living world, there must be a way that doesn't involve hurting my son." Eleanor's reflection in the mirror tilted its head, studying Sarah with an intensity that felt like being dissected by invisible scalpels. And for the first time, something other than malice crossed her ethereal features. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps calculation. What could you possibly offer me that would compare to the life force of a child, pure and untainted and malleable enough to host my spirit? The question hung in the stale air between them, and Sarah realized she was negotiating with a ghost, bargaining for her son's soul in an abandoned Victorian parlor, while autumn sunlight died outside the grimy windows. "Me," Sarah said simply. and the word felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss with no visible bottom. "Take me instead. I'm Catherine's heir, too. I'm living in her house. I'm part of this bloodline by choice, if not by birth. If you need someone to possess, someone to use as a vessel to return to the living world, take me and leave Thomas alone." The offer tumbled from her lips before she could fully consider the implications. Driven by the primal instinct that all mothers possess, the willingness to sacrifice everything, even existence itself, for their children, Eleanor's image in the mirror went completely still, frozen like a photograph, and for a long moment that stretched toward eternity. There was absolute silence in the parlor except for Sarah's ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart. Then Eleanor began to laugh, and it was not the cruel, mocking sound from before, but something else. Something that held genuine surprise and perhaps even a trace of admiration. "You would give yourself willingly? You would surrender your life, your body, your very soul, to save your son?" Eleanor's reflection moved closer to the glass, pressing both palms against it now, and the mirror's surface rippled and wavered like the boundary between worlds was dissolving. In 113 years, not one of Catherine's descendants ever offered themselves. They ran. They tried to sell the houses. They put up crosses and burned sage and hired priests, but none of them ever simply offered to pay the debt. Sarah could see something shifting in Eleanor's expression, a crack forming in the armor of rage that had sustained her through more than a century of imprisonment. "What Catherine did to you was monstrous," Sarah continued, seizing on that momentary uncertainty, that flicker of something human in the ghost's ancient eyes. "She took your life, your future, everything you could have been, and I can't undo that. But I can acknowledge it. I can bear witness to your pain and your loss, and I can offer you what you've been denied, a willing vessel, a conscious choice, a recognition that what happened to you matters." The words came from somewhere deep inside her, some well of compassion that existed even in the face of terror, and Sarah realized she meant every syllable. Eleanor Mercer had been wronged in a fundamental way, murdered by her own blood, and then trapped in a liminal space between life and death. And regardless of the threat she posed to Thomas, that truth deserved acknowledgement. The mirror's surface had grown so thin that Sarah could see through it now, as if Eleanor's world and hers were overlapping, merging, the boundaries between life and death becoming permeable. Eleanor's reflection was no longer just a reflection. She seemed three-dimensional, real, almost solid enough to touch. "You speak true words, Sarah Mitchell, and that is rarer than you might think. The dead have little use for lies, and we can taste sincerity like honey on the tongue." Eleanor pulled her hands back from the glass, and the rippling surface calmed slightly, solidifying back into something closer to normal. "But before I accept your offer, you must understand what it means. If I take your body as my vessel, your consciousness will not simply vanish. It will be pushed aside, trapped in the same prison of mirrors and glass that has held me for 113 years, able to watch but never live, never touch, never breathe. Are you prepared for that eternity, Sarah? Are you prepared to watch your son grow up from behind reflective surfaces, unable to speak to him, unable to hold him, unable to do anything but observe as I wear your face and live your life?" The full weight of Eleanor's words crashed over Sarah like a collapsing building, and for the first time she truly understood the magnitude of what she was offering. Not just death, which would at least be final, but an existence of perpetual observation, of being present but powerless, of watching Thomas live his entire life without ever being able to touch him again. Her legs finally gave out, and she sank to the dusty floor, her back against the armchair, tears streaming down her face as the reality settled into her bones, like ice. But even as she wept, even as horror and grief threatened to overwhelm her completely, she looked up at Eleanor's reflection in the mirror and whispered, "Yes, if it means Thomas is safe, if it means he can live his life free from this curse, then yes, I accept." The words tasted like ash and surrender, but also like love. The purest, most selfless kind of love that only exists between a parent and child. Eleanor's image in the mirror softened imperceptibly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note Sarah hadn't heard before. Something almost like regret. "You are braver than your ancestor, Sarah Mitchell. Catherine was a coward who murdered out of jealousy and greed, who wanted the family inheritance and couldn't bear to share it with her older sister. But you would sacrifice eternity for a child that isn't even of your blood." The last statement hung in the air with strange emphasis, and Sarah's breath caught as understanding bloomed. "How did you know Thomas is adopted?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Eleanor's smile returned, but gentler now, tinged with something that might have been sorrow. "I've watched you for 15 years, remember? I've seen every private moment, every tender gesture, every night you held him through nightmares and told him he was wanted, he was loved, he was yours in all the ways that mattered. Blood means nothing compared to that kind of devotion." The admission that Eleanor had witnessed Sarah's most intimate moments as a mother should have felt like a violation, but instead, it felt like validation. A ghost who had been denied motherhood herself recognizing the authenticity of Sarah's love. "Before we proceed," Eleanor continued, her reflection moving to sit in a chair that didn't exist in Sarah's side of the mirror, creating an eerie parallel to their conversation, "I must tell you the full truth, because you've earned that much. The curse I placed on Catherine's bloodline was born of rage and pain. Yes, but also of loneliness. For 113 years, I've been alone in the spaces between reflections, watching families live and love and die, watching generations pass. And the isolation is worse than any torture Catherine could have devised. I don't want your body simply for revenge anymore. Sarah, I want it because I'm so desperately, achingly tired of being alone." The confession transformed Eleanor from a malevolent force into something far more tragic, a woman who had suffered, not just murder, but more than a century of solitary confinement, trapped in a prison of her own making with no chance of parole. Sarah felt her terror begin to shift into something more complex, an emotion that combined fear with pity, self-preservation with empathy. "What if?" she said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "What if there was a way to break the curse without anyone having to be trapped? What if we could find Catherine's descendants and make them acknowledge what was done to you, give you the justice and recognition you were denied? Would that be enough to free you?" Eleanor's reflection went very still, and in the silence that followed, Sarah could hear the house itself seeming to hold its breath, as if the walls and foundations were listening, waiting to see what would happen next. "Catherine's descendants are scattered now," Eleanor said finally, her voice distant, as if she was looking at something far beyond the confines of the mirror. "Some died young, some moved away, some changed their names. But there is one, Catherine's great-great-grandson, who still lives in this town, in a nursing home on Maple Street. He's 93 years old and probably doesn't even remember the family stories anymore. But he carries Catherine's blood. If he acknowledged what she did, if he spoke the words aloud that his ancestor was a murderess, and I was wronged." Eleanor's voice caught, and Sarah realized with shock that the ghost was crying, silver tears running down her reflected face. "I don't know if it would be enough. The curse has roots that go deep, Sarah. Deeper than intention, deeper than words. But perhaps if the acknowledgement came with true remorse, if it was witnessed by someone with the power to care." And Sarah stood up, her legs shaky but holding, her mind racing through possibilities. "Take me to him, or tell me his name. I'll go to him today, right now, and I'll make him understand. I'll make him remember." Eleanor looked at her with something like wonder, as if Sarah was a creature she'd never encountered before, and couldn't quite comprehend. "His name is Edward Thornton, and he lives in Willowbrook Elder Care on Maple Street, room 217. But Sarah, he's old and frail and his mind comes and goes. What makes you think you can convince him to acknowledge a crime committed over a century ago by an ancestor he probably never met? Sarah moved toward the mirror, close enough now that she could see the fine details of Eleanor's Edwardian dress, the pearls at her throat, the delicate lace at her wrists. "Because I'll tell him the truth," she said firmly. "I'll tell him that his great-great-grandmother murdered her sister and cursed generations because of it. And I'll tell him that he has the power to make it right. And if words aren't enough, I'll bring proof. That photograph in my attic, historical records, whatever it takes to make him believe and acknowledge what happened to you." Sarah left the Mercer house with Eleanor's desperate hope clinging to her like cobwebs, and the autumn afternoon had deepened into early evening while she'd been inside, the sky bruised purple and orange like a healing wound. She ran back to her own house, bursting through the door with such urgency that Rachel jumped up from the couch where she'd been reading to Thomas. "Sarah, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Rachel stopped, realizing the inadvertent accuracy of her words. But Sarah had no time for explanations. She kissed Thomas's forehead. He was pale but calmer now, his eyes less haunted than they'd been that morning. And then she was running upstairs to the attic, her feet pounding on the stairs like a desperate heartbeat. The shoebox was exactly where she'd left it years ago, buried beneath Christmas ornations and forgotten memories, and her hands shook as she pulled out the sepia photograph of Eleanor Mercer, young and beautiful, and so heartbreakingly alive in that captured moment from 1912. "I need to go out again," Sarah called down to Rachel as she descended the stairs, clutching the photograph like a talisman. "There's someone I have to see, someone who can end all of this." Rachel's face was a mask of confusion and concern, but she nodded, trusting Sarah in the way that only sisters can, even when nothing makes sense. Sarah grabbed her car keys and was backing out of the driveway when she glanced at her rearview mirror and saw Eleanor there in the reflection, sitting in her back seat like a ghostly passenger, hitching a ride toward her own salvation. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, and the words carried such weight of emotion that Sarah had to blink back tears as she drove toward Maple Street, toward Willowbrook Eldercare, toward a confrontation that would determine all their fates. The nursing home was a modern building that seemed almost aggressively cheerful, all bright colors and motivational posters about the joy of aging gracefully, and it created a jarring contrast to the mission Sarah carried with her. The receptionist barely looked up when Sarah asked for Edward Thornton's room. Visiting hours were nearly over, but she waved Sarah through with a tired gesture that suggested she'd long ago stopped caring about minor rule violations. Room 2117 was at the end of a long corridor that smelled of disinfectant and old people, and something else Sarah couldn't quite identify. Maybe despair. Maybe just time. Slowly unwinding, she knocked softly on the door, and a frail voice called out, "Come in!" And Sarah pushed open the door to find an elderly man sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his body bent and withered, but his eyes still sharp and alert. "Mr. Thornton?" Sarah approached slowly, the photograph held carefully in both hands. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I need to talk to you about your family history, specifically about your great-great-grandmother, Catherine, and her sister, Eleanor." The old man's face transformed instantly, a flicker of recognition, and something darker passing across his weathered features. "I haven't heard those names in decades," he said slowly, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "My grandmother told me stories when I was young, before my parents forbade her to speak of such things. Catherine and Eleanor Mercer, the sister who died and the sister who lived, and the shame that followed our family for generations." Sarah felt Eleanor's presence intensify in the room, though Edward couldn't see her. Only Sarah could perceive the ghost's reflection in the dark window glass, watching with an intensity that made the air feel electric. "Eleanor didn't just die," Sarah said gently, kneeling beside Edward's wheelchair and showing him the photograph. "She was murdered. Catherine pushed her down the stairs of their family home, and took everything that should have been Eleanor's: the house, the inheritance, the life she deserved to live. And before she died, Eleanor cursed Catherine's bloodline, and that curse has been affecting people for 113 years. Edward's hands trembled as he reached for the photograph, his fingers gnarled with arthritis and age, but his touch was reverent, almost tender. "My grandmother told me," he whispered. "But I didn't want to believe it. She said Catherine confessed on her deathbed, said she was haunted by Eleanor's face in every mirror, every window, every piece of glass. The guilt ate at her for 60 years until she finally broke and told the truth. But by then it was too late. Eleanor was already gone, already trapped." Tears ran down the old man's weathered cheeks, and Sarah realized he'd been carrying this knowledge his entire life, a burden of ancestral sin that had poisoned his family tree at its roots. "You can make it right," Sarah said urgently, aware of how little time they might have, aware that the sun was setting outside the window, and Eleanor's presence was growing stronger as darkness fell. "You can acknowledge what Catherine did. You can speak the truth aloud and give Eleanor the recognition she was denied. Mr. Thornton, Edward, please. Your great-great-grandmother murdered her sister out of greed, and that act has poisoned generations. You have the power to break the curse, to free Eleanor from her prison, and free your family from the guilt. Will you do it? Will you speak the words that need to be spoken?" Edward looked from the photograph to Sarah's face, and then his eyes shifted to the window where Eleanor's reflection had become visible, even to him now, as if the acknowledgement of her story had made her more real, more present, more able to cross the boundaries between their worlds. Edward Thornton's voice was weak but steady as he spoke, directly to Eleanor's reflection in the darkening window, and every word seemed to carry the weight of 113 years of accumulated guilt and grief. "Eleanor Mercer, I acknowledge that my great-great-grandmother, Catherine, murdered you in cold blood, pushed you to your death out of jealousy and greed, and stole the life that should have been yours. On behalf of her bloodline, on behalf of all the descendants who have lived with this shame, I am deeply and profoundly sorry." The old man's tears fell freely now, but his gaze never wavered from Eleanor's ghostly form. "What Catherine did was monstrous and unforgivable, and you deserved better. You deserved justice and peace and a life fully lived. I acknowledge your pain, I acknowledge your rage, and I acknowledge that you were wronged in the most fundamental way possible." As the words filled the room, Sarah felt something shift in the air itself, as if reality was restructuring around them, as if the universe was listening and recording this moment for eternity. Eleanor's reflection grew brighter, more substantial, and for the first time since Sarah had encountered her, the ghost looked almost solid, almost real, almost alive. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and her voice was no longer cold or cruel, but filled with something that sounded like relief, like release, like the first deep breath after drowning for over a century. "Thank you for seeing me, for acknowledging me, for giving me what Catherine denied me, a voice, a witness, a recognition that I existed and mattered and was wronged." The curse's hold on her seemed to be loosening with each word, the chains of rage and vengeance that had bound her to mirrors and glass beginning to dissolve like morning fog in sunlight. But then Eleanor's image flickered violently, and her face contorted with pain, and Sarah realized with horror that acknowledgement alone wasn't enough. The curse had roots too deep, had become too much a part of Eleanor's existence over 113 years to simply vanish, because an old man spoke true words. "It's not working," Sarah cried out, watching Eleanor's form begin to fragment, to split apart like a reflection in shattering glass. "The curse is too strong. It's been too long." But Eleanor held up a hand, and despite the pain etched across her features, she smiled with surprising gentleness. "No, Sarah, it is working. The curse is breaking, but I've been dead for 113 years, and there's no life waiting for me on the other side of these mirrors anymore. I'm being released, but not into life, into whatever comes after, into the rest I should have found more than a century ago. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Freedom for Eleanor didn't mean possession or return to life. It meant finally being allowed to die properly, completely, to move beyond the liminal space she'd been trapped in for so long. Will I? Sarah started to ask if she would still be trapped in mirrors, if the curse would simply transfer to her. But Eleanor shook her head. The curse dies with me, and you'll be free. All of you will be free. Catherine's bloodline can finally live without this shadow hanging over them, and Thomas will never hear whispers from mirrors again. Eleanor's image was fading now, becoming translucent, and Sarah could see through her to the darkening sky beyond the window. I'm sorry I frightened your son, Eleanor continued, her voice growing distant, as if she was speaking from the far end of a long tunnel. I was so desperate, so lonely, so angry for so long, that I forgot what it meant to be human, to be kind. But you reminded me, Sarah. Your willingness to sacrifice yourself for Thomas. That reminded me of what love looks like, and it's that love that's finally setting me free. Edward Thornton reached out with his trembling hand, trying to touch Eleanor's fading reflection, and Sarah saw tears streaming down his weathered face. Go in peace, Eleanor, he whispered. Go and find the rest you were denied. You are released, you are acknowledged, and you are finally free. The words seemed to be the final key that unlocked Eleanor's prison, and her form began to dissolve like sugar in water, fragmenting into particles of light that sparkled and danced in the air before vanishing completely. The last thing Sarah saw was Eleanor's smile, genuine and warm and grateful. And then she was gone, and the window showed only the reflection of an old man in a wheelchair and a woman kneeling beside him, both of them weeping for a life that had been stolen 113 years ago and was finally being laid to rest. Sarah stayed with Edward for another hour, holding his hand as he told her stories his grandmother had shared, about Eleanor's kindness, her love of music, her dreams of becoming a teacher, all the small details that made her a real person rather than just a vengeful ghost. She played piano beautifully, Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. My grandmother said the house was always filled with music when Eleanor was alive. And after she died, Catherine could never bear to hear piano music again. The guilt ate at her every day, every hour, until she became a shell of a person living in a stolen house. As Edward spoke, Sarah understood that Catherine had been haunted too, had created her own prison of guilt and fear. And perhaps that was a kind of justice in itself, that the murderer had lived 60 years tormented by what she'd done, while Eleanor had at least finally found peace. When Sarah finally left Willowbrook Eldercare, the night had fully descended, and the stars were out, bright and clear and beautiful, in a way they rarely were in suburban areas. She drove home slowly, checking her rearview mirror occasionally. But there was no ghostly passenger this time, no reflection that didn't belong. The curse was broken, Eleanor was free, and Sarah felt the weight of the last 2 days finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. As she pulled into her driveway, she saw Thomas's face at the window of his bedroom, and when he saw her, he broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen since yesterday, and Sarah knew somehow that he felt it too. The lifting of the shadow, the return of safety and normalcy to their home. Rachel met her at the door, her face a mixture of relief and curiosity, and Sarah knew she'd have to explain everything, though she had no idea where to begin. But first she went straight to Thomas's room and held him tight, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo and feeling his small heart beat against her chest. Is she gone? Thomas whispered into her shoulder. The lady in the mirror, is she gone? Sarah pulled back to look at her son's face, seeing the color returning to his cheeks, the light coming back into his eyes. Yes, baby, she's gone. She's finally at peace and she'll never frighten you again. Thomas nodded solemnly, seeming to understand, in the way children sometimes do, that something significant had happened, that a story had ended and they were all safer for it. She wasn't bad, he said quietly. She was just sad and lonely for a really, really long time. In the days that followed, Sarah had all the mirrors in both houses blessed by a local priest, though she suspected it was unnecessary. The curse had died with Eleanor's release. She and Rachel helped Edward Thornton arrange for a proper memorial stone for Eleanor Mercer at the local cemetery, acknowledging her life and her unjust death. The Mercer house was eventually demolished, the lot sold to a developer who built a small park where children now played, their laughter filling the space where tragedy had once resided. Thomas never spoke of the lady in the mirror again, though sometimes Sarah would catch him looking at his reflection with a thoughtful expression, as if remembering something important that had slipped just beyond the reach of memory. The photograph of Eleanor Mercer found a place in Sarah's living room, a reminder that even the dead deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to be laid to rest with dignity. And on quiet nights, when Sarah looked at her own reflection in the bathroom mirror as she brushed her teeth, she sometimes whispered, "Rest well, Eleanor." The mirror never answered back, but Sarah liked to think that somewhere beyond the glass, beyond death and time and all the spaces in between, Eleanor Mercer had finally found her peace.